Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. We have had the distinct pleasure of having so many wonderful stories from the 1950s shared on this channel, the 1950s Fun Chat. Today will be a chat with a gentleman whose story, unlike any we've told before. Jackie, can you lead us into that?
Yes, and viewers, please note the purple banner below. Go to www.wildthewindmillwatch.com for information on this Fun Chat, to see and view all of the previous Fun Chats. I think it's about, 150 or so? Are
Yes,
we
150.
150? And very interesting, all of them. Also, on the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a book, While the Windmill Watched, A Slice of Rural America in the 1950s. That's the source of the impetus for this particular panel or platform that we have. But let's get going. This guest calls the forest his home. Duane Vaagen was born into the lumber and the forestry business in 1952 in Colville, Washington. He attended the community colleges of Spokane, and emphasizing business, and that has done him well. That education has done him well. But when Duane was 12 and still too young to work in the mill, he bought a chainsaw so he could thin trees on state and county land near his home. He was too young to drive, so his mother had to drive him to his work site. His grandfather operated portable cedar mills before and during World War II. His father, Bert, and Uncle Bud started Vaagen Brothers Lumber in 1952. A third-generation lumberman, Duane Vaagen is president of Vaagen Brothers Lumber Incorporated. He has overseen the company for more than 30 years, administering mills in Usk, Washington, and in Colville, Washington, where he resides with his family. He has 2 sons and a daughter who work in the business. Duane, welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you.
So, Duane, take us back to the roots of the Vaagen Brothers Lumber Incorporated and tell us about the original Vaagen Brothers leaving the area of Carpio, North Dakota, their journey west, and how they ended their journey in northeastern Washington, where they began a company which became a giant in the lumber industry.
Well, I wouldn't call it a giant, but we're still growing. We're still getting better. Our roots served us well as far as work ethic from the 9 brothers and a sister. With my dad, they worked the farm back in North Dakota. So the work out here, I think, became easier than what I heard the work was back there. And their background was from Norway, and my great-grandfather had a mill in Norway. We didn't know that till 2 years ago, and a lot of them migrated to Iowa and North Dakota, mostly North Dakota. So big family back there, mostly farming. I'm sure they had good years, but they had tough years, tough cycles. Hard to feed that large a family with 10 kids. But during the war is how a lot of people came out west. Because they had to train, and we had the Farragut State Park area where they trained, and some of the people met there. My dad and uncle met there before and during the war. And so the interest was to come west. My dad met my mom in Colville. So we've been here ever since. There was 4 boys, and then my uncle had 4 kids as well. They tried to get a lot of the brothers to come out from North Dakota. Several did. Most went back to North Dakota, which really surprised me because I'm not a flatland farm boy. We really grew up in this area, still adore it. But a couple stayed here quite a while. And there was other relatives around, and of course on my mom's side the relatives were very close and a large family as well, homesteaders. So it really grew up without the amenities of life. I mean, Running water was a pleasure back then.
Mm-hmm.
Electricity was a pleasure. But people weren't as, I would say, complicated about what their roles were back then. So working in a mill was very hard back in the 40s and 50s. But that didn't matter. You still worked hard. You learned how to work. We heard the stories of North Dakota and the snow drifts getting up to the eaves of the barn house. So we looked at things here like, I don't know why they still want to be back there, but they are, and they were. And I can tell you, people still, it's wherever they grow up is what they like. Because the guy we had guide us in Norway said there's nothing better than a field of various types of grain in North Dakota. You get sick. He spent time in Oslo. And I said, that's true, wherever you grow up. I mean, when our cousins visited, we'd take them up in the woods, pick huckleberries or whatever, but they were very uncomfortable. They thought they were going to fall off the mountain. And we were on roads, so they liked to come out and visit, but it scared them a little bit. So that's how they migrated to Colville. They didn't migrate anywhere else, but hearing the stories of your grandparents or your parents left an indelible mark on most of the people in my generation, because there was no such thing as embellishment and all those things. Whatever my grandparents or parents said was it, as far as I was concerned. And I think it was, and still to this day it is. So that made it a little to grow up.
And I think that was so true back in those years, perhaps because the Depression had such an impact on that generation of our parents and our grandparents. In order to survive, you had to work hard and listen well for your own benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything more to say about that, or should we go on to?
The Depression was well mentioned in our life growing up.
Mm-hmm.
It hurt everybody throughout the country, but they got through that cycle, and they probably appreciated everything after that Depression. And they didn't waste anything. I mean, if you had bent nails, they straightened them out and used them again. They didn't have a hardware store to run to every week. So food was short. They did what they could. I think all those people appreciated each other because they all went through the same thing. There wasn't government programs that I know of back then. They didn't talk about that. They just talked about how tough it was, but they'd only bring it up if they were asked. They didn't complain about how tough it was.
Yes.
So that was an important lesson, and left a mark, I think, on my generation, which is a good thing. That's why some people succeeded, because they knew they had it a lot easier than the generation prior.
Duane, when your family moved to Eastern Washington, how did they go about acquiring the land for logging?
Okay, usually back then, on my mom's side, he had the shake mills and built a sawmill, and he built a boiler and all that stuff. And he logged with horses, and my grandmother would set the chokers. And they would skid it in the mill and then make lumber out of it. But what happened was, it was usually other private land around that area, and they would trade shakes for other things, and sometimes money. And it was like a 6-hour drive to Spokane to deliver a 2-ton truck of shakes to go on a barn or a house. And they would go out and get the cedar logs and split the shakes or make the lumber or whatever. So it wasn't automated. There was some machinery, but it was dangerous. It was rough going, rough looking. You had to have mill ponds. You didn't have debarkers to take the bark off, and that's where all the dirt is in a log. So they had to change the saws a lot. A lot of things were difficult, but they developed wisdom by trial and error. And so they got better and better. But again, my grandfather shut his mill down during the war because of a boiler inspector. And then my dad worked for him. I know I saw pictures where he had a 2-man chainsaw. The logs weren't that big here. They just probably had that one. The trees back then might have been 30 to 40 inches, the big ones. And a lot of them were salvaged after the fires because the cedar is still good after the fire and the larch was still good after the fire.
Oh.
So they wanted to log burnt logs. And I noticed if you go out in the woods in our area, there's still stumps 8 feet tall. And I said, how in the world did they get up there? And they said, well, we waited until the snow was deep enough and hard enough. And we were on the snow, and then we cut that down. And some of them they didn't because it didn't get deep enough. So they had those undercuts. They put the scabbard board in. They stood on top of it and used a crosscut saw.
Okay.
So no motors at that point. You know, it's like back in North Dakota, they didn't have motors. I mean, the old thrashers were pulled with horses and pretty hard work. So this was pretty rude. And my dad and uncle learned a lot from my grandfather and decided they want to get in the logging business. Again, it was mostly private wood, but then there was a game department near us that they took logs off of. One thing led to the other. They bought a used truck, and then they got 2 used trucks, a used forklift. We had a mill pond. We had to throw all the logs in the mill pond. I was probably 6, 7. And that was a great job. I mean, it was fun being around a mill pond and taking the logs into the mill. Remember one night there was 2 of my brothers and myself. And it was in the summer, it was warm like this, and we fell asleep. My dad came over from the house and said, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
We all ran out of logs, and there's 3 of you. Why don't you guys go home and go to bed? At that point, I didn't know if we got fired or we had a job the next night. But we grew up in it. Everything transformed, and usually it had to be because you made progress at what you did. The bank weren't handing out money back then. So you had to do a better job to make sure you had enough money to pay the workers, a few, and be able to buy what you need to do with timber and all those things. So this operation has been through a lot of cycles, a lot of tough cycles. We're going through one right now that's interesting. I can't tell you what the results will be, but it's very, very interesting, dynamic. But back then it was a lot harder work. People complain, and I'm sitting in an air-conditioned room, and it's going to be 100 today, and it's still going to be 70 degrees in here. It's so much easier that you have to be grateful for what they went through.
Yes.
That's the one thing. They had high level of appreciation. They were very grateful people. All those traits were passed on, hopefully, and utilized. So work is a challenge, but it's a positive challenge. It's not bad.
Were a particular variety or kind of tree preferred for logging in your business?
I would say because of horses, the closest tree possible.
What
I see them, because they didn't have equipment to skid it in like a bulldozer or whatever. And they like to skid it in the snow because it went lots better with the horses. And then I know my grandfather on my mom's side had this old cat, and I mean, it was rust color because it was mainly rust, but he had ingenuity. And I know he invented a winch on the back before there was winches on Caterpillar. So he then was skidding, my grandmother was hooking it up. But back then, the sawmills weren't just in one place. Because of lack of skidders, they usually moved the shake mill to where the timber was.
Oh, okay.
And again, fire wasn't bad necessarily, but I remember them saying, we have to get a jump on it. And what it meant was to get away from the fire. They didn't have fast moving vehicles, so they had to run from fires back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And then they got equipment, so they tried to put them out, and they did. Now everybody says it's bad, shouldn't put out fire. I don't agree with that, but they logged this burnt timber, they made shakes, and they'd move 40 miles from one area to the other. somebody'd have burnt timber and said, come take a look. And they'd set up the mill for a summer and then go somewhere else. So they picked up a few pieces of property. We didn't really buy timber ground till in the 1980s, because back then most mills just tried to get better and better, and usually that meant a little bigger and better. And they were buying state and federal timber sales. Okay. The federal timber sales went away in the 80s. For the most part, we went from 8 billion feet down to 1 billion feet. So the competition level got very difficult. But now I'm talking in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, clear to today. But the wildfires are a bigger issue today than they were back there. And then, other than we can just drive away from them. I mean, we can drive away from the smoke. It's smoky here today. So this is our first day of smoke this season here in Colville.
Mm-hmm. And is this later than normal?
No, it's I would say it's a little earlier than normal. Mm-hmm. It's usually mid-July till 1st of September. Everywhere is different. Arizona, they have May 15th to July 1st is their season. I didn't know that till I traveled down there on some industry business. Same with New Mexico. They just had a big fire down at Ruidoso, New Mexico. Yeah. And right now we're burning up towns in the modern age. This is me ludicrous. I think generations ago, they had a very good excuse for not putting fires out. Mm-hmm. But we don't. We let them burn, and we want to pay people lots of money to watch them burn, in my opinion, unfortunately. Instead of put them out and then manage that area the best we know how for the greatest good of the people.
Yes. So my next question is, how has the lumber industry changed and emphasized the 50s? But now you kind of been alluding to some of the changes that we've had, or you've had in the business from 50s to the present time. Do any of those really stick out besides the fire management?
Oh, yeah. So you have to make more with less, which means you have to get more lumber out of that log. You got to get more products out of that log. Before, in the 50s, we just had piles of sawdust and they would decompose and everybody would gather them up to put them on their garden. But the pile got big. So then the next technology was wigwam burners up in rural America. The big towns, they did have boilers and power plants back in the 40s and 50s. We didn't. So most mills had a wigwam burner, and all the sawdust, all the slabs, all that went into the burn. You burned it up. Yeah. And our house was right across the mill, and we could see the sparks coming out of the burner. So we knew if the mill was running or down. But
do you have to have a photo of one of those for people who don't know what they look like? Can your assistant there come up with one while you're talking?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Our original burner is still out there 15 or 13 miles from here.
Yes, it is. I've seen it.
No, we've been involved with had a burner. I mean, we went to Ione, 40 miles away. They had a burner. It's gone. Republic, 50 miles away, had a burner. It's gone. We've been involved in some other operations, but it usually came down to federal timber became almost extinct. So those had to go away, which is unfortunate because usually we had 50 to 100 employees at each location. So the 50s was just plain brute hard work. The 60s was really a transition to electricity, motors, cylinders, a lot of assists so that with the same number of people, you could double your production. And then the 70s, that's the modern era. I mean, it changed big time. I mean, Spokane had a World's Fair in 1974, 50 years ago. But we were progressing. We never planed any of our lumber till 1970. And we had a planer mill my dad bought in Spokane next to the community college. So I just walked to college in the morning, worked the night at night. So everything's easier when you do that. I mean, I thought that's what you were supposed to do, but some of the kids had a lot more fun. I don't know how it turned out, but I always wondered how come all those stadiums are full of kids and how did they get there? So, no, we transitioned to 70s. That was the big time. Yeah, this is a typical picture of a wigwam burner.
Okay, hold it up. Oh, okay.
Yep, that's it.
That one has an extension on it. And that deal on the right is a typical cyclone where shavings are blown from the planer and put into the wigwam burner, which really helped to start and keep the fire going because logs are 50% water, so they don't like to burn. So on Monday mornings, you got to clean the burner out, which I would say was the toughest job in the industry because you're in there with a pick and a shovel. Sometimes it'd melt the bottom of your shoes. But you had to clean it, or you couldn't get air to it to get it burning. And a lot of the mills were green product. They didn't have the shavings to act as a catalyst to get it going. So wigwam burners were a pain. We were mandated to get rid of them by the Department of Ecology, and we did, which is the right thing because you could turn them into electricity. But the burners, that was a tough job. So those you don't see those. There might be a couple running in Canada somewhere, but they're more or less gone. And all those products are worth a lot more money. I mean, today you even bale the shavings for animal bedding. And sawdust goes to pellets, bark goes to beauty bark or electricity. There isn't anything not used when it comes into the plant site, and it goes out as a product.
Duane, back then, and maybe even still now, because you're living in the forest area, are most of the homes log cabins or not?
When I was a kid, most of them were back then. They were called homesteads.
Okay.
And the fields weren't big because they didn't have regular tractors. The plows were pulled with horses, say in the 40s. And the equipment was very slow and hard. And then those homesteads were made out of logs. And some of them were made out of lumber that people like my grandfather would trade logs for lumber. And you can still see some of those homesteads. When you go back to Norway today, you will see homes that are still being used that were built way before our time. And they can tell which country those people migrated from by the construction of the house logs, how they notched them, they cut them. And you see that here today. We still have some homesteads that are empty. The game department took over Little Ponderay Game Range a long time ago. And those homesteaders, I think it was in the 40s and 50s, were asked to leave. And those homes were still standing for a lot of years. And then they went and burned them, they said, because of safety, which is unfortunate. But that was next to our property. So we got to see those. We knew some of the people down there. But now those homesteads are gone. A lot of the fields back then are now full of trees. And they're all volunteer trees. They weren't planted. They're almost like a weed. So it looks a lot different, probably more like, and they're thinning that forest because of fire. So it's going to look a lot like the forest did 140 years ago.
Okay.
Very good tour out there.
Is there, and I imagine this depends on perhaps the species of the tree or the size of the tree, the age of the tree, but a log, just generally, what is the value of a log?
Well, I got a hard hat that I've had for 40 years, and it says the value of a log is $20, and that was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
The value of a piece of lumber was $5. A sticker was $1. The byproducts weren't much back then, but it depends on the size. A 2x4 today, 16 foot, is worth about $3.75. Let's call it $4.
Okay.
And out of our smallest log, we try to get 2x4s.
Do you wait for a tree to get to be a certain diameter or a certain age?
No. When you go harvest the stand, there's a prescription the state has, the feds have, private landowners have, the industrial have. I mean, we've always been selective cut, our family, for years and years. And I remember early 70s when they invented clear cuts. That was the worst thing politically we could have done as an industry. as you traveled over Snoqualmie Falls, there was these big clear cuts. And there was a company that got a lot of railroad land that kind of invented it. Forest Service looked at it and said, you know, that's a good idea. So the Forest Service started doing it. And then the environmental movement was aroused at that point. And it takes time to recover. You go to those same areas of 70, and now they're ready to harvest again. And they're the green areas. They're not the dead and dying trees. In our area, we do have a lot of dead and dying. We have a lot of burnt timber. So there's a different prescription, and everybody, the landowners, all have their preferred outcome. You know, it can be for habitat, for animals, water, air. And it's funny that this is still a study of science, and that science is the best outcome you can get, but it's always changing. So some of these, we average a 6-inch log with our 2 mills. So that's less than a dinner plate. That's about the size of your saucer plate.
Mm-hmm.
And we can go up to the size of a steering wheel, little less than that. So it's very small logs. And it's an interesting question, because what we've done, from me cutting those little tiny logs with a little tiny chainsaw, making fence posts, a lot of this area was burnt in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. So it's recovered naturally. It wasn't planted.
So it was burnt because of wildfires, or why?
Because of wildfires.
Okay.
Yes. Because of wildfires, burnt large swaths. These are the ones that homesteaders ran from. But usually they had fields around their homestead so they didn't get burned out. But we looked at all those, and I said, they're big enough to get a product out of. So we got fence posts, and that's back in the early 60s. Well, trees keep growing even though they're thick. So what the Forest Service said is not any good. Back in the 60s, they took D8 cats to the top of the mountain and ran them down to the bottom. And it looks like a rake now, trying to get it to release and grow. But it was kind of stagnant. And it didn't grow a lot, but they were trying to thin the forest. And you really need to do it. We started out by hand. Now we have equipment to do it. They still haven't gotten to where they need to thin all those acres that were clear cut, say in the 60s and 70s. But all that stuff that was burnt in the 30s is ready to be thinned again. That's what we focus on. And they want us to take the 60% is the smallest. And the Forest Service, this is an interesting story, because the Forest Service says, well, that's low value and no value. And we said, well, we're going to turn it into value. And we have with pulp chips. We can take anything over a 2.5 inch and grind it into chips and haul it to a paper mill. And they go through cycles, so you got to watch it. And then the smallest diameter tree beyond that, we turn into 2x4s. As they get bigger per pattern, we add more boards. And it turns out those are strong boards. We run them through a machine that tells us how strong they are and a different grade. So we send a lot of lumber to South Dakota and Iowa, some to North Dakota, and it's for trusses. So the floor trusses and the ceiling trusses, what they call machine stress rated. So they're super strong and they carry the snow load. So,
does lumber have to go through a treating process in order to make it more stable?
well, we do grade it. This is machine graded. And now we have technology from Finland that the computer, it looks, this is kind of the AI technology. It's looking at all the grains, all the knots, computes it in split seconds and tells you what's in that board.
Wow.
So we put the grade stamp on it because we have to belong to an association that says we're certifying this is the grade of that board. So now that's machine instead of people grade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you find that you export much lumber out of this country?
Actually, we send quite a bit to Canada. Of course, the Canadians send a lot down here. That's sometimes they're our friends, sometimes not. We've had 2 mills in Canada, and both of them are shut down. So they're good neighbors. But during one cycle, I can't remember the year, it was tough. We were down to 1 shift, and we'd always been at 2 shifts. We were down to less than 100 people. We were up to 499 at our heyday. And the market, we were losing money. We ended up running, I think, 60% of our product, metric size, and shipped it to Australia for like a year and a half. And that saved us through that cycle. So you're always looking, what's going to get us through the next cycle? And each time you do that, you get better. So we're in that cycle now. So we're looking at what can we do for this cycle that's unique and adds value.
And do you find that when you hire a worker, do you have a certain protocol that you want them to know in order to work for you and for their different position? Or do people come to you wanting to work just because they have this love for logging and have that in their background?
Nowadays, I would think not so much. We hire what's available. Character matters.
Yes.
Some of their history matters. You get some surprises, but over the years, we've been around thousands of people because there's turnover and the different operations. So our turnover rate's not bad. It's better than the average, but some of our workers have been with us for 40 plus years, 20 plus years. It's a family operation. It's not it's a private company, but it's really a family organization. We try to have like an annual carnival for all the kids here on site, and there'll be 150 people show up, and we have golf tournaments and just various things because we all live here.
Sure.
And that's important. So it's a family, but a team effort.
Sure. Which leads me into, I've been thinking of this as you've been talking. I've seen competitions for log rolling, is it? Where they get on the logs and they...
Yeah.
Does that happen?
Tree chopping or...
Yeah, happen in your area?
I saw it a few years back on top of the pass at Kellogg on the ski hill. They had a little competition up at top there in the summer. We had a competition a couple of years ago, well, more than 40 years ago. At the fairground, and we did set up a pond. We had the guys with the axe and the crosscut saws and the souped up chainsaws, the whole thing, even skidding with bulldozers and timed, and it was a lot of fun. And we just did it because this is such a forest products community that I don't think they charged, but it's like a fair, only it was with wood products. We haven't done it since. Probably should be looked at. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and a lot of work though
Putting it together. Yeah.
Yeah, by a team.
And are your children involved in the business, Duane?
Right now, my daughter is, and my youngest son is. My other son has a business next door with cross-laminated timber, which is a new product nationally. It's been in Europe for a number of years, very successful. We haven't figured it out as a nation as far as building codes and engineering, but we're getting there. It's a nice product. So it's like plywood, only with sticks of lumber real thick instead of veneer sheets. It's a good product. And I lost a son, 15, so the family dynamics changed, had cousins involved, brothers involved. So ever changing, you progress. So, and get better.
That cross-laminated timber business that it's just started, what, 4 years ago?
Yeah, 4 years ago.
Anyway, so are there standard sizes that are built, or do you wait for an order because the building that wants these is special?
It's a engineered building, so it's a one engineered at a time. There's not a standard like a modular home yet. I think they'll come up with that. It makes good bridges. It's very strong. They have 18-story buildings. I stayed at a CLT hotel, the world's largest wood structure at the time in Norway. They called it the hotel. It was beautiful. It's like the Coeur d'Alene Resort. Really comparable.
Yeah.
I thought it was neater. It was all wood. Laminated, strong and impressive. So I think it's coming, but it can't compete with lumber stick frame because it's much cheaper. But people in Europe, Scandinavia, build to last. I mean, there's houses that are 1500s made out of wood, still standing. Here, 100 years is a big deal. So a lot of houses don't look good after 50, but I think that's because of the people don't maintain them.
Yeah.
So wood is a great product. So CLT will be a product of the future, but it has to compete with that cement or steel structure that maybe costs the same, but people love to live around wood. It's warm. So it's gaining popularity. It will. It will be engineered, and it's got to go through its learning curve and cycles.
Duane, when you harvest in an area, how do you go about replanting it?
There's two ways. So in this area, the predominant one was natural regeneration, which the state Department of Natural Resource still does. So they'll take 80% of the trees out, leave the best, top 20, to be the seed trees. Of course, in Scandinavia, they call them the queen trees, given off the offspring that's healthy. The feds still do a little bit of clear cutting, but they'll cut only 60% and leave the healthiest. We think they're too close together, so they're too apt to burn because of fuel matters going up to the other trees. So there's various prescriptions on which trees to cut. And most of the time, that's not up to us. The agencies will mark the trees either to leave or to cut. So we have to go by that. And there's all kinds of restrictions. I mean, if you own private land here, it's unfortunate, but if it's along a creek, you can't cut it. And I think I don't know if it's 7% or whatever, but there's a severance tax. So the state gets money if you own the trees, and then they get to tell you what trees you can cut and you can't. Unfortunate for those private landowners, say, God, I'm paying all these taxes and they're telling me what I can and can't do. And I said, it's not fair. You hope that doesn't come down to every field of crop. People understand food better than shelter, I guess, would be my.
Yes. What an amazing story of a life that's so different from anything that I ever knew or we ever knew growing up in North Dakota. And that's why these fun chats are so interesting, because it's the history of a united nation, who we are in America, and we learn about all these wonderful lives that were lived in the 50s and the influences that have gone through to the next generation and beyond that. So Duane, in finishing up our fun chat today, you talked about the CLT, cross-laminated timber. Where else do you see the future of the timber industry?
Well, that's an open-ended, wisdom-finding question. I would sense that it's in protecting communities from wildfire, creating the cleanest atmosphere with air and water that we can do. When they're looking at climate change, I don't get it. The more we could thin, the more climate we save. Harvesting timber appropriately can be the biggest application of climate change in a positive manner, the biggest, bar any. But the environmental community is given a lot of money by the government, to sue the industry and win in court and get more money, and then have donors that say, we want zero cut. We don't want to cut any of the timber. So briefly, America is set up on the national forest level, say a third in wilderness, no motorized vehicles, not even a chainsaw. You have to thin the trails with crosscut. So it's going back 100 years. I'm going to go with that. You have that. That's good. In 92, 94, they designated nearly another third in roadless. So you can't build roads I'm hoping that we can still, in the future, thin that to protect it from fire because of wildfire smoke. And maybe not my lifetime, but the next generation, they will find wildfire smoke is killing more people than anything else in the United States. I'm just taking a wild stab at that. So the last third is available for timber management or forest management. I call it forest management. That's what other countries call it. It's not timber harvesting, it's forest management. It's to make it better for habitat, animals, people, air, water. But a third of that's off limits because of streams, regulations. So it's not leaving a lot for us to help climate change, is it?
But it sounds as if you're doing your very best within the parameters that you've been given.
Well, I think our crew and team here deserves an award for making it a healthier state that we live in, area. And we need more of it, but we have to do the small logs, which are very unattractive to our industry.
Yeah.
Why run a little log if you can run a bigger log?
Right.
But we looked at this 50 years ago and said, we got to do something. So we're doing something. And why the agency in DC doesn't say, we want you to thin as many acres as possible. Instead, they set up what I call an artificial market shortage. They're bidding all these mills out of business, like in Montana. They put enough desirable timber in all of them, and usually the bigs get them. And they say it's not the bigs that always win. It's always the fastest, not the biggest. So we got to figure out how do we get there and treat those acres in a desirable way and make this healthy forest and healthy communities. It's tied together.
It's stewarding. It's the same way in farming. It's stewarding the land. It's stewarding the forest.
Respect.
Yeah, we call it truth, respect, and appreciation for the forest.
You bet.
That's
a
good 3 words to end on.
Duane, thank you so much for being our guest today. Oh, how you've enlightened us. And I hope that it's been a great run for you to go back into your history and share it with our viewers.
Oh, yeah. Well, I made it sound as good as possible, I think.
Okay.
There were some hardships along the way.
Yeah.
Jackie, can you close our program today, please?
Okay, thank
Viewers,
you.
Thank you for your time. So viewers, we hope that you have learned something. This channel has changed the goal, enlightened the goal of the 50s, and that is we want to educate this with this modern history. So until next time, tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat. Until then, toodaloo.
Bye-bye.